Logic.
Oh, awesome. Hey, everyone. We're the Logic Magicians. I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Zach.
So today we're going to be talking about, I kind of think of it as taking the topic of logic kind of out of this void of etherealness and really grounding it in the physical reality of thinking, because it's not just taking place in your head, so to speak. There's all kinds of different factors of just biology that play into critical thinking things through, etc. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. And I do, wait, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, what is your opinion on thinking and therefore being?
I think that it's impossible to talk about thinking outside of the context of the body, outside of the context of how the brain works, outside the context of nutrition and energy levels. And so that's kind of what
you think with your gut.
No. And so that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. And I do want to very much upfront say that I am not a scientist. This is not particularly my field of study. I've done in grad school, I did take a course on kind of material culture and embodiment studies, and that really did focus on kind of religious experiences, though there is obviously, I think, some overlap. And so because of that, because I'm not going to be actually relying on necessarily my own knowledge on this, I will be linking to the articles that I'm kind of using as a point of reference, or that I've used in the past as a point of reference for my conclusions. I'll be linking those in the description down below. Or if you're listening on the podcast.
And I will be having all of the questions that you have and asking them, and that way we can find out just how little he actually knows.
Oh, goodness. But yeah, so, this is something that in my logic classes I teach at the school I teach at, I go into somewhat, but very superficially, especially because I first introduced students to logical concepts in 7th grade. And a lot of this stuff is, it's about like neurology and all kinds of things like that. And again, my class is in a science class. So I go into some of these things. Some of them I actually don't go into my class, but I think is really important for kind of a more in-depth look at logic. So we'll be talking kind of about those things. So yeah.
Woohoo!
Yeah. So let's go ahead and dive in. I think yeah.
Wait. Card or coin?
Card.
Card. Okay. Just no question. No reason. I'm just asking. No reason at all.
Awesome. By the way, you might be wondering why the channel is called Logic Magicians. That's pretty cool. The reason it's called Logic Magicians is because one of my 7th graders, when I said the word logicians, I was referring to my class, my students as logicians. He apparently misheard me and asked if I said Logic Magicians, and I was like, that's not inaccurate. That works. So that's where Logic Magicians came from.
And I do magic too, so.
And Zach does magic, and we're going to be doing magic tricks and logic, so it fits really well with what we're doing here. So yeah, so are we going to do a trick?
No, I'm not going to do a trick. Well, maybe I will.
Okay.
I don't know. These cards are the cards that they used in the hit film Now You See Me.
That was a good movie.
They were specially ordered for that movie, and I bought a pair or a deck because, I don't know, for fun.
That'll be awesome. That's a really good movie. I enjoyed it. And actually, we're going to be talking about, especially when we're talking about logical fallacies, I think I think magic specifically uses a lot of actually kind of the things we'll be talking about today. kind of shortcuts that your brain takes, assumptions you make, things like that, which we'll definitely be able to talk about that some and tie things in. So kind of getting started on the topic for the day. One of the first things I actually want to talk about is kind of a very basic level introduction, and a really important place to start. And we're going to be talking about the process of thinking, and basically just saying something that seems obvious, but I think a lot of times people don't think about, and that is that thinking requires energy. And we're not talking about like ethereal vibes or anything like that. We're talking about literal nutrition-based energy. The biological body takes, various, I don't want to say chemicals, but it takes various compounds that you eat, that you consume, and it turns it into energy. So it breaks down into sugars, things like that, and your body uses that to function. Your brain uses this energy. And what that means, and I think what a really important conclusion is actually that your brain power, or your ability to think critically, is limited. Okay, so even if you're, like super duper educated, super duper smart, super duper, like you've, taken all the logic classes, you still have a finite resource when it comes to thinking, and especially thinking critically, which takes more energy. So you are, okay, yeah, go ahead.
Where does the soul come into that? Because some would argue that when you said you have a limited amount of thinking as of brain power as you go down, but where does the crossover happen from mortal being to immortal being? And do we think the same way with the spiritual body? Let's hear it, John.
If we kind of like move into kind of talk about the spiritual realm, I'm not, and again, I have a master's in religious studies, but that by no means means that I know everything about all religions ever. I generally don't think that people associate kind of the soul or spiritual realities with specifically critical thinking and cognitive thinking. I think when it is associated with various levels of thinking, I think it's generally a little bit more similar to intuition, I would say. I would say that's kind of just and again, this is anecdotal evidence. This is not like I went out and did a study on, whether or not people think that, your soul solves math problems or deductive logic or things like that. Like, I've not done that, but from what I've experienced, and, other people talking about, it's usually actually, frankly, kind of contrasted with critical thinking, or contrasted with kind of step-by-step logical thinking, and there's more of a instinctive kind of reactionary aspect of I guess information processing through the soul. Does that make sense?
Sure. You could have just said, I don't know.
Well, that would have been shorter. Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think that that part generally comes into play when people are talking about specifically critical thinking. And even then, I think people would acknowledge that there are physical limitations to what people can do that does correlate with nutrition, that does correlate with energy levels, things like that.
Sure.
And so I think that's really important to take into consideration, because if you're real, and again, these are things we kind of instinctively know, but if you're really tired, right? If you maybe didn't sleep well, or you haven't eaten yet that day, then your energy levels are going to be generally lower. And that doesn't just affect whether or not, you can go run a marathon on the spot, or whether you can, actively focus on your work or things like that. It genuinely impacts your brain's ability to function. And that's, I think, important to know. So if you're interacting, especially with new thoughts, and we'll be talking about that some today as well, then it's important to make sure that you are creating an environment for yourself that is conducive to thinking. So making sure that you're well rested, making sure that you've eaten, and again, you don't want to necessarily think right after you've eaten, because actually your body pulls all the blood into your stomach area, which means your brain is going to be less oxygenated. And so again, thinking is going to be a little more difficult. think, you know, Thanksgiving lunch, and how that's not the best time for critical thinking.
Well, I've prepared well for this because I've been eating nothing but Twizzlers and only having coffee the last 4 days. So I'm in the best mindset.
Awesome, awesome. And then beyond just the kind of intentional aspect of that, of making sure that when you're thinking critically that you're giving yourself that environment, also acknowledging that people don't always have the opportunity, or do not have the same opportunities to create that kind of environment. So especially people who do not have access to as nutritious food, or people who you know, are maybe working 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. There's literally going to be less opportunity for those people to think critically. Again, not because of any capacity that they have on like an intelligence level or anything like that. It's genuinely, purely just the fact that energy is a limited resource, and by necessity, they have to use it elsewhere. So in some ways, I think it is important to acknowledge that certain levels of critical thinking, or certain environments that are conducive to critical thinking, are somewhat privileged, actually. You know, being able to have appropriate nutrition, have the time to set aside to, you know, make sure you're rested, make sure that you can engage things kind of on your own terms, is something to keep in mind, especially when you're engaging in kind of critical discussions with other people.
Thinking is a privilege. Use it well. Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
and well, not just that, like thinking is a privilege, but uh, just keeping these factors in mind when you're having a conversation with someone, that, and we'll kind of be talking about that, that a lot of times people will give responses and kind of instinctive, reactive responses, and it might be because they haven't had time to think things through, or they don't have an opportunity to think things through, which is important, I think, to take in consideration when you're having a conversation with someone. And this kind of leads us into the next discussion of this embodiment, or understanding critical thinking as well in the framework of biological systems and context. And that is that the brain, your brain, is attempting to be efficient. Okay, because energy levels are a limited resource, your brain is doing everything it can to conserve energy. And this is not always a good thing. Like overall, it's you know, good for your, like from a survival kind of, I guess, evolutionary, but especially that survival perspective, your brain being efficient and not using up unnecessary energy is important. It's great. It's you know, kind of the example I give. We'll kind of talk about this in more detail when something scary happens, like let's say you know, you're in a car accident. Your brain diverts energy and does different things so that you're able to focus on your immediate physical needs, as opposed to long-term, short-term memory, critical thinking, things like that. So there are very much times when what your brain does is necessary, important, and, you know, helps you out. But there are definitely times when your brain is being efficient and trying to conserve energy that very much causes problems with logical thinking. You know, I joke with my students. Yeah.
Question. Would you say that, I'm just thinking of, I know that it's common for people to like answer something right away and then justify their thinking for it because of that.
Yeah.
And we might cover this later, I don't know, but
Yeah.
that concept of you ask somebody when they're not prepared a serious question and they give you the off the cuff answer,
Mm-hmm.
and then when you ask them why, they convince themselves that that's right even if it's wrong. Is that?
Yeah, definitely. And that is definitely something that I think we'll talk about down the line. We can talk a little bit about it now. There's actually a philosopher called David Hume, and he was a Scottish philosopher. Yeah, he's very interesting, and I teach about him in my ethics class, which is kind of my sophomore junior class I teach at the school I'm at. And his kind of system of ethics is primarily based on the fact that ethical statements are based on, he calls them whims, And I think that word has kind of changed in meaning a little bit since when he was using it, it has a little bit more of a negative connotation. But basically what he says is people have a gut reaction response to ethical dilemmas or ethical problems. And they have that emotional reaction first, and then they kind of retroactively justify it through critical thinking. So they're kind of reversing what you're supposed to do. I used air quotes there because supposed to do is, again,
Subjective.
yeah, it's subjective and
I learned something.
yeah. Um, and but I do think a lot of us resonate with that somewhat, with like we have an emotional reaction to a statement and then we kind of retroactively justify it using critical thinking. And Hume's kind of conclusion from that is that all of our ethics and all of our moral statements are just emotional reactions, and that the justification is inherently flawed because it happens after the fact once we've already come to our conclusion, which is kind of backwards from how you're, like, again, air quotes, supposed to come to conclusions, where you start with the facts and then you use logical processes and you come to a logical conclusion. But at the same, I somewhat disagree with that conclusion. I think you can have an emotional reaction to something, and then maybe give yourself some time to calm down, take a nap, eat some food, let it sit so you're ready, etc. And then think the process through and still come to the same conclusion, even though you're using kind of critical thinking methodologies. But I do think there is something there where a lot of times people come to an emotional conclusion based on initial reactions and then pretty much cherry pick information, which we'll talk about cherry picking, but it's when you pick facts or arguments that support your side while ignore ones that don't support your side to conclude your emotional conclusion. And that is very much kind of part of your brain taking shortcuts. And especially and we'll talk a little bit about how I think identity plays into critical thinking in a different episode, but it also helps preserve a person's identity, which is pretty important for, I think, more the communication side than the logic side, though the logic side comes into play some as well. But so kind of going back, that was a really good question, and definitely something we'll explore later on in a little bit more detail. But what I like to, yeah, and that's kind of the point of this channel, is to do a little bit more of a deep dive. And so what I like to tell my students is, and they always get a laugh out of it because I think a lot of them see it as a justification for some of their behaviors, which genuinely, just developmentally, it is. I say that they all have a lazy brain, and everyone has a lazy brain. Everyone's brain is trying to put in as little effort as possible to conserve as much energy as possible. And what we need to do as logicians, or logic magicians, is develop a self-awareness, which again is tough because that self-awareness already requires some energy input, which your brain is actively, or well, I guess passively working against. So it takes some effort to be able to exert effort. Is kind of the catch-22 there.
Right.
But it's about developing the self-awareness to realize when your brain is being lazy, when your brain is taking shortcuts, and that particular problem will really manifest itself when we're talking about in the next episode or two. We're talking about logical fallacies, which are just generally speaking shortcuts that your brain takes to jump to conclusions that aren't actually justified. And so, that's what we're going to be diving into later on. But for now, just understand that your brain is lazy, it's trying to conserve energy, and it takes critical thinking shortcuts. And so what we need to do is start cultivating a self-awareness of these shortcuts, which is kind of one of the things that this project is all about.
So how do you recognize your brain doing something that it does without thinking?
So again, it's going to be one of those things where you have to intentionally invest time into it. And being able to intentionally invest time into it is, again, something that's not going to be an option for everyone, or available to the same level as everyone. But I do think that kind of introducing people to these thoughts, even just through these videos, will kind of bring this content, especially the logical fallacies section, will bring this content to kind of the forefront of people's minds, or at least a little bit more forward in their minds, so they can start kind of developing that self-reflection.
Right. Cool. So it's like cognitive therapy, where you become cognitive of the unconscious processes that are influencing your everyday life.
Exactly. Actually, that's exactly it.
All right, that's in the video.
Yeah.
That's all, guys. Thanks for watching.
Yeah, we do have a couple more things
Oh,
to go over, but yeah, no, I think that's I hadn't made that connection. I like that. But yeah, so it's about cultivating a self-awareness, and through that self-awareness, giving yourself time to process the thoughts and ideas that you're encountering, which again, a lot of times is either not available, or I can't help but think about like discussions on social media, which should lend themselves to having more time to think things through, because it's written. You don't have to respond immediately. It's not an in-person conversation. But oftentimes I kind of see the opposite, where response times are very quick, and responses are not necessarily thought through as much. And so I think that's important to consider.
On the social media side of things, I almost view it as like the way people treat their homes, where it's like, my home is my castle and you don't disrespect me on my castle. And
Yeah.
post on your page, it's saying, this is my opinion and you don't disrespect my opinion because it's from my castle, even though you're projecting it into the public arena.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's a bit of a breakdown of the wall between kind of private and public, or not even necessarily a breakdown of wall, but more of a conflating of the two, the private and public, into this miasma of bad logic. So, yeah. So that was
only post on a Word document. All of my social media is on a Word document. I don't tell anybody. It's just really at that point. Not even media. It's just the journal.
I was gonna say it's called a journal. So yeah, so that's kind of the first point that I was wanting to make in this video, is that thinking, especially critical thinking, and kind of so to speak, higher order, again I'm using air quotes here, higher order thinking requires a lot of energy, which your brain doesn't like to use. And so it's something to be self-aware of when you are trying to think, that your brain is passively working against you, and that you have to put in additional effort to kind of counteract your brain's reflexive reactions to things.
Would you say that there's a better time of day to think about things than other times?
So, and this is again where this is not necessarily my field of study, so to speak. And I do also want to make sure that I'm not committing any fallacies, and we'll go over that later. We're talking a little bit in generalizations here. And as we're going to be moving on, I'm going to be repeatedly saying, like, this is a bit of a generalization, but I wouldn't generalize to any specific individual. Where we're talking about the average person, or like statistical average of people, and the times that people are active, or their brains are most active, is going to change from person to person. So, the average person might be most productive from, and I'm kind of just like making this up at the, very anecdotal, et cetera, et cetera. The average person, let's say, is most active from, like, I don't know, 9 to noon, right? So between meals, so noon, you're starting to get distracted by how hungry you are, your body's needing more energy, et cetera, et cetera. But let's say that's kind of when you're most active. I know personally, not so much now, because I'm getting older, and I'm not nearly as, I don't have nearly as much boundless energy as I used to. But like up until like really just a year or two ago, my brain was most active and I was most productive actually between like 10 p.m. and like 1 a.m. And so that's actually when I have historically got kind of my best work done. And that really just depends on the person.
Yeah.
Um,
There's a great book by a guy called Daniel Pink. He wrote the book Drive, the things that influence us, and his new book is called When, and it explores that very concept of natural energy levels.
yeah,
And it's interesting. I've only got a few chapters into it, but Lindsay has read through it and has applied the principles to her daily life, and
awesome.
it's been very helpful, especially if she's pregnant and her energy levels are decreasing. Um,
Sure.
but it's a good book if you want to read more on
Yeah,
that
no,
stuff.
definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I would assume that, and again, these things aren't like set in stone. So it's not like, oh, well, I'm a night person, so I can't do any work in the morning, or I'm a morning person. So, there's clearly some level of variability. Like, I've been able to change my schedule. I teach my first class at, what is it, 7:40 in the morning, which, back in college, I didn't schedule any classes before like 11 o'clock, because that was just, I got to pick my schedule and that's what I went with. So, and I would say that I'm very much alert and very much active even in my morning classes. So again, there are ways to kind of change your schedule, change your routine to account for different times of day. Um, but there, so again, it's about developing self-awareness, and kind of intentionally looking at, well, when am I most productive in the day? What kind of time during the day do I do my best thinking, things like that. And again, acknowledging that sometimes that time, um, maybe when you're at work and you don't have the luxury of being able to just sit there and think, about existence for like 2 hours straight, right? So again, that's why I think this type of discussion about embodiment is so important, to realize that, if you're just having trouble critical thinking, it's not necessarily something you're doing wrong. It's just part of your biological reality and your context. So I think that is very important to acknowledge and keep in
It's not you, it's your brain.
mind. Yeah, yeah. It's the bio. I would say it's not you. It's the biology of your brain. Um,
You can't put that on a bumper sticker. It doesn't read
that's
as well.
true. That's true. We should make T-shirts. It's not you. It's your brain. um, so yeah, that was kind of the first point I want to make about the brain and energy levels. And then another really important component, this is kind of point two, is actually it has to do with various hormones and how they affect your body. Specifically, we're going to be talking a little bit about adrenaline and cortisol and their effects on your brain as well as your body. Now, this is actually something I don't necessarily, I kind of lump cortisol into adrenaline when I'm teaching students, which is, again, I'm not a science guy. It's not my field, but I don't actually do it with logic. I actually primarily do it with public speaking, because there's actually a lot of physiological effects of those two hormones to public speaking, specifically because, there's actually a study out there that shows people are more afraid of public speaking than dying. And, which actually, if I'm phrasing it accurately, it's more people are afraid of public speaking than are afraid of dying. Not necessarily that they're more afraid of public speaking than dying,
Right.
but that's a little shorthand that people like to use. And it very much plays a role in that. So basically, adrenaline and cortisol are hormones that your amygdala, which is part of your brain, releases. Well, your amygdala actually recognizes the stressful situation, and it sends a signal to another part of your brain, and that releases these two hormones into your body. And they have very specific roles that they're playing. Now, when we're talking about stressful situations, kind of, when we're talking about what people have traditionally called your lizard brain, or your kind of mammal brain, or the different parts of your brain, adrenaline and cortisol kind of suppress the critical thinking part of your brain, and it pours all of its energy into specifically like muscle stuff. So it activates. Yeah, exactly. So when you encounter a stressful situation, um, kind of evolutionarily or kind of survival instinct wise, and you know, I kind of use those two things somewhat interchangeably. I know the word evolution is sometimes not favored by people, but when we're talking about survival instinct, your body has in the past had to react to physical threats more so than kind of existential or intellectual threats, or threats to your identity. And so when your body experiences stress, then your body kind of shuts down your critical thinking parts of your brain and activates your kind of muscle memory parts of your brain, your instinctive reactions parts. And as I'm saying this, even kind of based on our previous discussion, we can probably see why that's a bad thing for critical thinking. Yeah.
I have an anecdotal story regarding adrenaline.
Excellent.
So Lindsay and I just moved into our flat here, and we have our bed in the hallway instead of a bedroom because we made our bedroom anyway. So we were sleeping one night, and Rupert, our cat, comes and curls up on my chest, and I wake up when he steps on me and purrs and then lays down. And so I wake up and he's on my chest, and then the next thing I know, I hear a loud crashing noise in a different room, and I'm waking up from a dead sleep into a guttural, the most savage scream I have ever let loose, and I just start yelling. Nothing in particular, just ah! And I jump out of bed and I'm into the kitchen before I realize that I'm in my underwear. I don't have my glasses and I'm essentially blind. If there's someone in the house, I have no idea what I'm. And then, so I was like, I guess I'll just keep yelling. And so I started yelling and clapping as loud as I could to make as much noise. And then turns out that after Rupert had settled down, I fell asleep, and then he got up and knocked something off of the counter. So that's what adrenaline will do to you. You'll get into the kitchen in your underwear before you even know it.
Yeah, and again, like, you know, when that happened, right? I had like right after you woke up, right when adrenaline hit, had I asked you, can you explain in great nuance this particular political philosophy that you have? You wouldn't, you physically, because of your brain, would not have been able to do that. So what cortisol and adrenaline kind of do together, cortisol basically, it blocks the neural pathways into your what's called the prefrontal cortex, which is where most of your critical thinking happens. And again, like I said, I'm going to be linking to some of these articles I'm using in the description. And so it literally is blocking your critical thinking, because critical thinking takes energy and it takes more time, which in a stressful situation, when it's a survival consideration, those are two things that you don't want. You want to conserve energy, and you need to react quickly to, you know, threats that are around you. So it's going to shut down or it's going to limit, not completely shut down, it's going to limit your prefrontal cortex, or prefrontal cortex or prefrontal lobe, I'm not sure. Yeah, again, articles down below. And so that's going to be inhibiting your critical thinking. And the cortisol also blocks off your hippocampus, which is another part of your brain, specifically the part of your brain that researchers say deals with short-term, long-term, and episodic memory. So basically every type of memory. So if you've ever gotten to a point where like you have to take a test, or you have to deliver a speech, which is something my students have to do, and you get to that point and you get stressed out, you get nervous, you get anxious, and you forget everything, right? That is literally because of adrenaline and cortisol blocking off your short-term, long-term, and episodic memory because of the stressful situation. And again, this is something that I don't think people take into consideration. And so that's why, like when I'm giving a test or a quiz, I try to use a variety of kind of mitigating tactics to bring those anxiety levels down. Whether that's, you know, I kind of, this is what I usually do, is I set the test or quiz up to be more difficult than it actually is. And then I actually will like last minute say like, and like literally right before I give them the test, I'll say, and you can use your notes, which immediately takes the stressful situation from like, oh my goodness, it's so stressful, to a much less stressful. There's, you know, a lot of relief that takes place there. Your brain kind of gets over the fact that it's being threatened by a stressful situation, so to speak. So I think that does help students remember things a little bit better. They also have their notes as support. Or
could you do the
sorry, what?
opposite thing where you make it sound really stressful, but they can use their notes, and then last minute say, "Just kidding, no notes allowed."
I think I'd like have an actual riot from my students if I did that. And generally speaking, I try to, you know, make decisions that help students, don't disadvantage them. And so again, it's important to again realize that if you're in a stressful situation, if you're in a flight or fight situation, which nowadays is much more often kind of existential threats or threats to your identity, your kind of picture of yourself or your self-image and how you think of yourself, that is going to trigger cortisol and adrenaline, which is one, going to kind of shut down your access to short-term, long-term memory. So you won't be able to, you know, maybe you did a whole lot of research on this topic and maybe you're even an expert in the area, but then all of a sudden you got nothing to say because that part of your brain's being shut down. And it also, your lazy brain, which is again kind of instinctively already lazy, is going to be extra super duper lazy because it's trying to conserve energy, because your body is still going through the same physiological processes that you would go through if you were threatened by a bear, which in one situation, right, being energy efficient and not, again, like when you're being chased by a bear, you don't have to remember long division, right, or how trigonometry works, right? That's not going to be,
it's not when you're awake. When you're dreaming, that might be a good
that's true, right? But those things aren't useful to surviving a bear attack. But because, you know, society is kind of changed from when these brain patterns or these brain reflexes got into place, and now the threats we normally encounter on a day-to-day basis, and again, you know, there are different people who experience a lot more danger in their lives than I do, for example, and so that obviously is going to affect our ability to think as well. So we're not generalizing to everyone here. We're saying on average a person experiences less day-to-day danger now than, you know, 500, 600, 1,000 years in the past.
Yeah.
But your body still has the same reaction as if it were a physical threat. And this means that, especially when you're talking about something that you hold to be important to yourself, right, to your self-image, or something that you think defines you, your body is going to view that as a threat to your survival, and it's going to go into the same type of, like, you know, you already said the fight or flight thing, but specifically with the introduction of cortisol and adrenaline into your body, that's going to be shutting down short-term, long-term, and episodic memory, and it's going to be severely inhibiting your the critical thinking part of your brain. All of things which are significant and necessary to have a conversation.
Yeah. One of the things that I used to do when Johnny and I were on the speech team was, before giving a speech, if you're really nervous, a good way to help break that is to get some kind of small object and toss it back and forth between your hands, because by doing that, it activates both sides of your brain because both hands are being active, and it's considered a fine motor skill, which is a more nuanced, and it can help not reverse necessarily, but calm down the stream of adrenaline and push it blood back into your brain. And it's a simple trick that you can do.
Yeah. And like, while we're kind of on the topic, I think this is a great place. So I actually really focus primarily, like I said, on adrenaline and cortisol with my public speaking class, my rhetoric class that I teach. And there are so many physiological effects of adrenaline that are directly like inhibitive to public speaking, which, because of how anxious people get with it, it's very, I think, important. So not only does that part of your brain shut down, but adrenaline basically when adrenaline hits, your breathing speeds up, your heart rate speeds up, and together that has the effect of over-oxygenating your bloodstream, which is what is its goal. It's trying to get as much blood into your muscles because, or sorry, as much oxygen through your blood into your muscles, because your body uses oxygen. Your muscles use oxygen as energy. Like they burn that, they turn that into energy, or they use it in the process. And so your muscles now have an excess of energy, which, Zach, how does that manifest? Right? Also, because your extremities, exactly, because your extremities have way too much energy, you start to shake because that's your body trying to burn off the excess energy. And oh, there's what?
My teeth always chattered.
Yes, because that's still your muscles contracting. Also, while you're breathing and your voice gets all wavery, your diaphragm, actually, like right here, what's the muscle that contracts and expands your lungs? Your diaphragm is a muscle, which, because literally like all your muscles start to be jittery because of the energy, your diaphragm does as well, which is why you might get a shaky voice, because your lungs are literally like contracting like this and expanding like this. So it literally impacts your ability to speak clearly. And not only that, now that your muscles are shaking and burning a lot of energy, what does burning energy generate?
Sweat.
Well, it generates heat, which then your body is trying to cool itself down, which manifests as sweat. So that's why when you're nervous, you start to sweat a whole lot. Exactly. So again, adrenaline and cortisol are very important for like physical survival. If you're in like a car accident, or if, especially here in New Hampshire, there are bears around. So or mooses as well, right? If you have a bear or a moose encounter, that's very important. But when you're trying to think critically, or when you're trying to engage someone in a debate, then those, particularly those two hormones, have very inhibitive. Again, I don't want to say bad, because I don't want to say that bodily functions are bad. Bodily functions happen, they have effects, but it inhibits kind of effective argumentation on a number of levels. And so that's, again, something to consider. So if you are talking about something that is very close to you, that is tied with your identity, then it's a very good idea to, again, and I don't want to say that it's bad to have emotional responses, right? Emotional responses aren't inherently bad. If the goal or purpose is some critical thinking, then you might want to give yourself some time to let that adrenaline and cortisol, those adrenaline and cortisol levels, come down a bit, so you do have access to those parts of your brain. And just counting to 10 actually isn't enough. So I know people a lot of times say, count to 10. Counting to 10 is not enough time to give your body to regulate itself. But doing some breathing exercises, which again is going to bring that over-oxygenation of your body down, is really important. So doing some breathing exercises, and give yourself, even a few minutes, or even an hour, to calm down from that initial adrenaline reaction, to be able to have access to those higher order thinking parts of your brain. So the prefrontal cortex and your hippocampus, so that you have access to your memory and your critical thinking. So that's going to be important there as well. And then another thing that ties into that, and this is more kind of a long-term, and so this is we're going to be talking about kind of long-term exposure to cortisol, which is the kind of stress hormone, what it does to your brain. So this is something that is more of something to keep in mind for context, just in your life in general, and like the negative effects that stress have, and the long-term problems they can cause for logic and critical thinking. So more recent studies have shown that prolonged exposure to cortisol, so being in a kind of, or I guess chronic stress syndrome is essentially what it is. So being exposed to stress for a long time, so this is not, again, not weeks, not months, this is more like years of kind of accumulated stress, cortisol actually starts to break down your hippocampus. It damages your hippocampus. And again, your hippocampus is part of your brain that focuses primarily on memory. And they actually have noticed that this can very much affect people with, or there's correlation, not necessarily causation, but it kind of exacerbates it with patients who have dementia or Alzheimer's. There's a breakdown of and damage to that part of the brain that cortisol kind of exacerbates. So again, it's one of those things where if, especially kind of long-term critical thinking, and we're talking about over a lifespan, right? There are various scenarios where if you have a life where stress is not as present, right? And again, this can't be boiled down to an individual level. You can't say, you know, people who have a stress-free life are going to have, you know, a perfectly intact hippocampus, and people who do have. So again, this is we're talking about medical studies, not individuals, which is important to remember. Exactly. It's not like a one-to-one ratio where, like, if this is how much stress you've experienced, this is what your hippocampus is going to be like. Okay, so I really want to clarify that we're not saying if you led a stressful life, then you're not going to be able to remember things. That's not the case. But it does, again, show that a lot of times critical thinking, and especially lifelong ability to engage in critical thinking, is very much tied to privilege, right? And being able to live a life that has less stress, less stressors in it. Which again, that's not to say that people with privilege can't experience stress. That's not something to say that, you know, so again, we're not talking about individuals here. We're talking about generalities, statistics, kind of medical field averages. Which again, kind of reinforces that, and again, this is lifelong, long-term stuff that we're talking about. And so that was basically what I wanted to talk about when we're talking about adrenaline and cortisol and their effects on critical thinking. So the first point was that your brain is efficient and doesn't want to use energy, so we need to be self-aware. Second point is when stress is introduced into a conversation or a debate, or even just thinking about a topic, then that directly inhibits your ability to critical think.
Yep.
And now we get into our third point that I want to talk about, and this is, again, this is more long-term. This is a more discussion of long-term, again, lifelong pursuits of critical thinking, things like that. And this is a term that is called neuroplasticity.
Oh, I read a book on that.
Oh yeah, well, how about you tell us a little bit about neuroplasticity then?
Oh, me? Oh, it's been like a year since I read the book. It's by Niels Bohrmann. His area of study is actually patients that suffer from locked-in syndrome. So like unable to physically interact with the outside world. Mm-hmm. But what he found was that like patients with ALS, as they were declining into that locked-in state, they were able to teach them to think in certain patterns about things. And so they hook them up to the EKG machines, and then they're able to communicate and even write letters to their loved ones just by thinking their brainwaves, because they can go through enough training. But where it got interesting was even people that have been in the locked-in state before this previous training, you're still able to train them. And it's an example of the neuroplasticity of even like when all you have left is your brain, you can still learn new things and add skills and whatnot.
Yeah, that's awesome. And again, I do want to just like ask if you're going to do a trick at some point, just to
heck yeah, you want a trick? Should we do a magic
trick?
Yeah,
let's do that before we transition to neuroplasticity.
Okay, I have to put the camera down. Oh, Not that, that's okay. That's fine.
That works.
Okay, so I'm going to be using the deck, and I want you. It doesn't matter actually. Doing tricks via Zoom are hard because it's like, what am I gonna do? Because normally, I like to have the interaction.
Sure.
So 5 of Diamonds is the card, and I'm gonna
I'm pretty
put
sure
that.
it's a King of Spades.
No.
I'm just being difficult.
So I put it in the middle of one and then in the middle of the other to ensure that it's as middle as it can be. And then I use a Joker card because Jokers are funny. And the other Joker card. And then via magic, I throw the 5 of Diamonds and it gets caught by the Jokers. And there it is.
Wow.
How's that for adrenaline?
That's very cool. Woo! Awesome.
Yeah. So I did some, I've done 3 or 4 magic shows, and the stress of like the shakes really mess with it. Because if you're
Oh, sure.
like palming multiple coins, this is called the coins talking. And so if you're palming multiple coins and you've got the little jitters, it's like everybody can hear that, and
Oh, yeah.
it's no
Having a
fun.
little conversation.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. So that was our
Neuroplasticity, eh?
neuroplasticity. So, and actually, I really like what you were talking about with that particular book, because there's actually been, from what I can read, several developments in discussion of neuroplasticity. It used to be that people thought that basically so we'll actually define neuroplasticity
Yeah,
in
we should
general.
define that. I never did
Yeah,
that.
no, you're fine. Neuroplasticity is your brain's ability to make new connections. Your brain's ability to kind of train itself to do new activities, to retain information in new ways, to think in different ways. So it's about creating new connections between neurons, and it's how well your brain is able to do that. And so previously, in the past, neuroplasticity was kind of viewed as, children had like super duper neuroplastic, I don't know if that's the term, but brains that could adapt and learn new stuff very, very well. And it kind of like peaks when you're 25. And then again, this is on average, kind of peaks when you're 25. And then it just is kind of downhill from there. Now, research similar to the one that Zach just cited, there's showing more and more that that's not the entire picture of things. Like, we're able to make new connections much more later on in life. And I know specifically like neuroplasticity in various fields of science has often been used to kind of discriminate against people. I know there's kind of this negative stereotype out there where like only young people can be like really good at math, or young mathematicians are going to make the next great discovery. And so there's definitely some ageism that can come into play regarding neuroplasticity. And so again, I want to highlight that we're talking in kind of medical generalities, medical averages, but this by no means is meant to restrict or kind of indicate that a person is less able. And research is showing more and more that though, yes, your brain's ability to develop those new neural pathways does start to decline around 25, that by no means means that you're unable to develop those neural pathways later on in life. Or yeah, so again, I do want to kind of talk about this issue, but I also want to say that if you're past 25, which both of us are, that you can't kind of develop new ways of thinking, you can't develop new neural pathways, or develop even better critical thinking skills.
Yeah. In the realm of hypnosis, the example that they use is, think of your brain as a jungle, and by thinking, you're carving out a new pathway.
Yeah.
And so the common ways that we think are the easiest, because that's the way that our brain naturally does that. But you can actively seek out a new pathway and cut a new path through the jungle. And the first few times it's going to be harder, but the more that you do that, it's going to get easier. and that's neuroplasticity in action.
Exactly, and that's actually a perfect example. I couldn't have said it better myself. And that's essentially what we're trying to do here, right? You know, you hear terms like, you know, common senses and all that, common things like that. But critical thinking skills are genuinely, they're skills. They're not things that people are kind of born with, right? You don't know not to make generalizations just kind of automatically, because that's actually how your brain works. Your brain categorizes and makes generalizations because why?
Because of the lazy brain.
Exactly, because it's lazy, because it's an efficient way to process data. Doesn't mean it's a good way to process data.
I had a much longer and more physiological answer to that. And then I was like, oh no, that was, that was a call and return, not a.
Exactly. So, you know, critical thinking and the skills that we're going to be exploring in this series is not something that is inherent to your brain. They're not neural pathways that your brain automatically develops, and it takes effort and self-awareness to develop these types of critical thinking skills that will contribute to engaging in, I guess, more productive critical thinking and more accurate critical thinking. And so, so I do want to highlight that, yes, you know, I think it's awesome that I'm teaching seventh graders logic concepts. I actually am able to teach them pretty complex deductive logic stuff that I didn't learn until I was in college. And seventh graders, I was worried were going to really struggle, but they pick it up like that. Like it's their favorite part of the class, and it baffles me. Because again, I didn't learn it until I was later. But so yes, I think it's great that children and young adults are learning these skills when your brain does, on average, have a little bit more predisposition towards developing these new neural pathways and these new ways of thinking. But that doesn't mean that you can't develop them later on in life. Right. And I think it's, you know, like Zach, I think you took did you take a critical thinking class in college? I can't remember.
Probably not. I'm not very critical.
Well, but I'd say that's inaccurate. But again, like, you know, this is the first time you're going to probably hear about some of the deductive logical concepts that we're going to be talking about.
It took logic and
critical
debate.
Reasoning.
Yeah. Well.
Okay. Yeah. So you covered some, but like, you know, when I'm talking to people about this and they don't have any experience in it, it doesn't mean that you can't learn these things.
Yeah.
Right. Even if you're later on, you're like, both of us are over 25. If we were encountering these ideas for the first time, it doesn't mean we can't encounter them. It doesn't mean we can't develop kind of better critical thinking skills. But it does take kind of attention and self-awareness and intentionality when you're trying to develop these skills. And it is, you know, like the analogy you used, it is very much getting in the habit of, I guess, making new pathways in the jungle and intentionally working on the methods of critical thinking that we're going to be talking about. And you absolutely can get into those types of habits. And the more you do it, right, the stronger those neural pathways are going to be, the more connections you're going to have in your brain, the more efficient it will become to think in that manner. And the more, just biologically, that your brain is going to default to those styles of thinking, is just because, again, biologically, physiologically, the neurons have more connections on that, and it's more energy efficient for your brain to do that. So
there's one story of neuroplasticity that I find absolutely amazing. I ran into it a few years ago, and so there was a French guy who worked as a garbage collector, and he started to get headaches, and he wasn't sure what was going on with that. So he went to the doctor, and they did all of the tests, and they're like, yeah, maybe you're fine. He was 44 at the time, and so he went in, and they did a brain scan on him, and he was missing 90% of his brain. He had a disease when he was a teenager that caused increased brain fluid to be created, and so they added a shunt in to push that out. But apparently, sometime after it was installed, it stopped working. And so what happened was, from the inside of the brain out, it started to just crush his brain until
Hmm.
there was only the outer edges of his brain and his brain stem. I've got the picture of his MRI pulled up um, here to show all of that black space.
Whoa.
And the guy was 44 years old at the time, working a normal job, had married with kids, and was able to completely normal function despite literally missing most of his brain.
Yeah,
And he used to have one, but because of neuroplasticity, it simply rewired and reconnected
exactly.
and changed it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like the brain is capable of amazing things. Like really, like as I was doing a little bit more in-depth research for this, because again, I do very surface level stuff with my kids because it's not a science class. I just need to kind of know the most practical things that's going to apply to logic and public speaking. But the more research I did, I was like, oh my goodness, there is so much to dive into here. And again, like I said, this isn't my field of study, and we're going to be linking all the articles that we're kind of using as reference, kind of as primary sources, or I guess secondary sources, some as well, for this discussion that we've had, and encourage you to look into it more if it's something you're interested in. But these are definitely kind of just the practical things to take into consideration when you are wanting to engage in critical thinking, or if you're wanting to develop critical thinking skills.
Yeah.
So,
Cool.
well, that's all I have. Is there anything that you would like to add, Zach?
I think that the brain is fascinating. Showing my cards as a Christian, I think it's the crowning achievement of God. I think it's fascinating and really interesting. And I've never thought of it in terms of logic related. I've always just thought of it more as like, what the heck goes on up there related.
Sure.
It's sorry, I was playing with a coin. It was it's really cool to think about it from that logic perspective, because I haven't thought of that, of the idea of privilege, one, the concept of being nervous when you're debating somebody or even having a discussion, and the impact that that could have both ways, because if I am going against you and you're nervous about it, you're not going to be as articulate, which is going to further
Yeah.
the belief that I have, and that can be dangerous both ways. And so just being aware of those chemicals and being able to step back and have a breath and then talk more openly is
Yeah.
incredibly beneficial.
Yeah, and I think the more and more like I can dispel the idea that logic is this pure ethereal thing that happens amongst intellectuals that is like inaccessible. I think the better it is. It's not inaccessible. It's about forming habits. It's about learning new things. It's about recognizing the effect that your body has on your ability to think. And I think that's a really important kind of practical component of critical thinking that I think often gets overlooked in favor of these idealized understandings of thinking that are inaccurate and unobtainable.
But we know what that is, though, is lazy brain in action, because if you make them
Exactly.
unattainable, then you don't have to work for it.
Exactly. So basically, get over your lazy brain.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Well, that's all that we have for you today. Thanks so much for tuning in. And yeah, this has been Logical Magicians.
Logical fallacies next time?
Yes. Yeah. Next time we're going to be talking about logical fallacies, which are specific ways that your brain is lazy.
Cool.
So if you want to play us out, Zach.
All right. Thanks for watching, everybody. Magician. Full circle.
Bye, everyone. Awesome. Awesome. The effect that your body has on your ability to think. And I think that's a really important kind of practical component of critical thinking that I think often gets overlooked in favor of these idealized understandings of thinking that are inaccurate and unobtainable.
But we know what that is, though, is lazy brain in action, because if you make them
Exactly.
unattainable, then you don't have to work for it.
Exactly. So basically, get over your lazy brain.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Well, that's all that we have for you today. Thanks so much for tuning in. And yeah, this has been Logical
We're gonna do
Magicians.
logical fallacies next time?
Yes. Yeah. Next time we're going to be talking about logical fallacies, which are specific ways that your brain is lazy.
Cool.
So if you want to play us out, Zach.
All right. Thanks for watching, everybody. Magician. Full circle.
Bye, everyone. Awesome.